Am I the whole for feeling betrayed by my husband after I broke my wrist, and he refused to help me get to work, only to find out it was about his shame over his car? The constant ache in my wrist is a persistent reminder of my recent fall in the yard. It's been a few days now, and the heavy cast feels like a permanent fixture. For weeks, at least, the doctor said. For weeks of this limited mobility. It feels like an eternity when every mundane task, from buttering toast to pulling up my jeans, becomes a frustrating ordeal. I've been trying to stay positive, telling myself it's just a temporary setback, that I'll be back to normal soon. But then the harsh reality of returning to work hit me, and with it, a wave of anxiety and anger I hadn't anticipated. My job is full-time, in person, a good 30-minute drive from our home. I've already taken the last 2 days off, navigating the awkwardness of a broken wrist and the challenges of everyday life. But Monday is fast approaching, and I absolutely have to go back to work. We rely on my income. There's simply no other option. The biggest hurdle, the one that's causing me sleepless nights, is my car. It's a stick shift. And, of course, the broken wrist is on my dominant arm, the one I use to change gears. I've tried, foolishly, to even imagine the motion, and it's impossible. I can't grip the shifter, can't move it, which means I literally cannot drive my own car. My husband, on the other hand, drives an automatic. It's not a fancy car, but it's dependable, and most importantly, it doesn't require any gear shifting. I could easily drive it. So, a couple of days ago, I approached him, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, and asked if we could switch cars for a few weeks, just until my wrist healed enough for me to manage my own vehicle again. His response was immediate and uncompromising, a flat-out no. His reasoning? He simply doesn't like driving my car. I was dumbfounded. I'm the one who patiently taught him how to drive a stick shift, and he's certainly used my car before without a peep of complaint when his own was in the shop. This wasn't about his ability, it was purely about his preference. His personal preference, it seemed, was more important than my immediate, pressing need. That dismissive attitude felt like a punch to the gut, but I swallowed my disappointment and tried to find an alternative. Okay, I said, trying to maintain an even, hopeful tone. If switching cars is out of the question, would you be willing to drive me to and from work, at least a few times a week? I thought this might be a more agreeable option, less of an inconvenience than driving my stick shift every day. But again, a swift, firm no. His excuse this time? He didn't want to wake up early. Let me lay out his schedule for you, because his reasoning felt incredibly weak and selfish. He works 3 evening shifts per week. By the time he'd need to leave for his job, I would already be home with his car, having used it for my morning commute. And when it came to picking me up in the evenings, he'd have more than enough time to drive me home from my job without being late for his own shift. This isn't some huge, life-altering request I'm making. We're talking about a couple of half-hour drives, a few days a week, for a very limited time. And, to reiterate a rather critical point, I am the primary breadwinner in our household. My income is absolutely essential. We literally depend on the money I earn to keep our lives running smoothly, to pay our bills, and to put food on the table. When I gently pointed out that his refusal would force me into an incredibly expensive alternative, he just shrugged and casually suggested I just Uber. Ubering for a 30-minute commute would cost at least $60 a day. That translates to $300 a week, or a staggering $1,200 a month, just for transportation. I simply cannot afford that. It's not a viable solution, and he knows it perfectly well. I feel utterly and completely unsupported. It's not just the sheer inconvenience of this entire situation, which is significant enough on its own. It's the profound lack of willingness on his part to help me out, to even consider a minor adjustment to his routine when I'm facing a very real, tangible crisis. I fully understand that having a broken wrist is a pain for everyone involved in the household. But my wrist is broken, not his. And I can't shake the feeling that he's either forgotten, or simply doesn't care, about the times I've gone above and beyond for him. I keep replaying the scenario from a couple of years ago in my head. His car was completely out of commission. It was dead, and he had no other way to get to work. What did I do? I didn't hesitate for a second. I immediately offered him my car. He worked more back then, 5 days a week, and I didn't even bat an eye. I let him use it for his commute, yes, but also to go out with his friends, for errands, for everything he needed to do. I never once complained about the inconvenience to me. I never made him feel like a burden. I never, not once, suggested he just Uber when my car was freely available and sitting in the driveway. I did it because that's what partners do. You support each other, especially when one of you is in a difficult spot. You step up. Now, let's be absolutely clear. I'm not saying he owes me anything. That's not how a healthy partnership should operate. You don't keep a running tally of favors or debts. But there's a world of difference between not owing someone and being completely unwilling to extend a helping hand when your partner is facing a genuine hardship, one that directly impacts their ability to work and our shared financial well-being. The ache in my wrist is still a dull, persistent throb, a constant reminder of my broken bone. It's been 4 days since my accident, 4 days of navigating life with one arm, and 4 days of agonizing over how I was going to get to work. Today, Monday, was the day I had to go back. The thought of it, combined with my husband's baffling refusal to help, had been gnawing at me. Over the weekend, I'd tried to process his outright rejections. His flimsy excuses about not liking my car or not wanting to wake up early just didn't sit right. He's always been a good partner, usually supportive. This felt off. It felt cold and uncaring, and it was deeply unsettling. I knew he'd been struggling a bit lately. His hours at work got cut a while ago. He used to work as much as I did, sometimes even more. Now, his shifts are fewer and his paychecks are smaller. I know he's been actively looking for a new job or even a second one to make up the difference. He spends hours online, sending out resumes, making calls. I've seen the effort he puts in, so that's not something I'm worried about. He's genuinely trying to improve our financial situation. But this car situation, my commute, it was a different kind of problem. It was an immediate crisis, and I couldn't understand why he was being so unyielding. So, this morning, before I had to leave for work, I sat him down. This wasn't a casual chat. It was a serious conversation, a non-negotiable, we need to talk. Look, I started, trying to keep my voice even, despite the knot of frustration in my stomach. I get that you're having a hard time with your hours being cut, and that navigating the job market right now isn't easy. I really do. But I have a good job, and I need to be able to get there. I literally can't drive my own car with this broken wrist, and I simply cannot afford to pay for an Uber every day while I heal. We have to find a solution, and we have to find it now. He immediately started talking in circles, repeating the same tired reasons he'd given me before. I don't like your stick shift, he mumbled. I don't want to wake up early to drive you. The excuses felt hollow, thin, and utterly unbelievable. My patience, already worn thin by the pain in my wrist and the stress of the situation, snapped. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken accusation. He looked away, shifted in his seat, and for a long moment, there was just silence. Then, slowly, painfully, the truth started to trickle out. His voice was barely a whisper at first, full of shame and embarrassment. Since his hours got cut, he confessed, he hadn't been able to maintain his car properly. He used to be so diligent about it, always on top of oil changes, tire rotations, brake checks. He had a decent amount of savings before, and he'd use that for car maintenance and his share of our bills. But when his hours were slashed, he started dipping into those savings just to cover his part of our shared expenses. And when those savings started running low, he finally, reluctantly, let me help him readjust our household spending. I had been pushing for it from the start, suggesting we tighten our belts a bit and reevaluate our budget, but he'd stubbornly refused, insisting he could manage. It was only when his savings account was nearly depleted that he finally agreed to even talk about it. And that's when the car problems started piling up. When his savings ran low, he couldn't afford to fix them. He needs new tires, he told me, looking at his hands. Badly. The brakes are worn down, making a worrying grinding noise that he's been ignoring. Even the AC stopped working months ago, a minor annoyance compared to the other issues, but another sign of neglect. And he's well overdue for an oil change. All these things he used to keep up with religiously, but he just hasn't been able to afford it. He was ashamed, he said, his voice cracking. He didn't want me to use his car or even ride in it because he didn't want me to know how bad it truly was. He was so embarrassed by the state of his vehicle that he never brought it up. So, for months, he's been driving an unsafe car, a vehicle that could potentially put him in danger, all because he couldn't afford the repairs and didn't want to admit it to me. And that's why he didn't want me to drive it. He was trying to protect me, in his own misguided way, from what he perceived as a shameful secret. The anger I felt earlier started to melt away, replaced by a complex mix of sympathy and a fresh wave of frustration. Sympathy for his shame, for the burden he'd been carrying alone. But frustration, too, that he hadn't felt comfortable enough to tell me, his wife, about this financial struggle. That he'd rather let me suffer and struggle with my own commute than admit his vulnerability. It's a lot to take in. My wrist still aches, but now my heart does too. burdened by this new revelation and the difficult conversations that lie ahead. After that raw, difficult conversation yesterday morning, where the truth about his car and his hidden struggles finally spilled out, we spent hours talking. It was a long, emotional, and frankly, exhausting discussion. The anger I initially felt, that sharp sting of betrayal, slowly began to soften as he explained the shame he felt. How his pride wouldn't let him admit he was struggling, how he'd been silently battling the financial strain since his hours got cut. He confessed he'd been using his dwindling savings to cover his share of the bills, and that car maintenance had been the first thing to get cut. It was heartbreaking to hear the vulnerability in his voice, to realize he'd been carrying this heavy burden alone, too ashamed to tell me, his wife. We finally got down to business, focusing on his car. The immediate issues were the brakes and the oil change. He usually handles all the car maintenance, but with my wrist in a cast, I couldn't physically help much. Still, I wasn't going to sit idly by. I pulled up tutorials on my phone, reading him the steps for replacing brake pads and doing an oil change. When he hit a snag or wasn't sure about something, we put our heads together, puzzling it out. His dad even joined us via FaceTime, offering advice and moral support from afar. Between our combined brain power, we managed to get it done. It felt good, a strange sense of accomplishment born out of necessity and cooperation. The tires are a bigger expense, but they aren't an immediate crisis. We agreed to look for good quality used tires this week. They need to be done, yes, but they can wait a few more days while we arrange it. As for the AC, we decided to put that on the back burner. That's a comfort issue, not a safety one, and definitely not a priority right now, especially with the weather being mild. We're focusing on what's essential for safety and function. So, in the end, it was a hidden struggle, a private battle he'd been fighting. I usually don't ride in his car or drive it for that matter, so I never had a reason to notice the worn tires, the grinding brakes, or the missing AC. He had successfully kept the extent of his financial difficulties and the resulting neglect of his car completely hidden from me. I knew he was struggling with a cut in his income. I'd been pushing and pushing for him to let me do more, to let me take on more of the financial load, to readjust our budget more significantly. But his pride, that stubborn, misguided pride, had held him back. And his car, unfortunately, had suffered the consequences. And honestly, as I reflect on it, I think I might have done the same thing in his shoes. It's a terrible feeling, that sense of failing to provide, of not being able to keep up. The weirdest part of all this is the mix of emotions I'm grappling with. On one hand, I still feel a bit betrayed. The trust, at least in this specific area, has eroded a bit. The fact that he was willing to let me struggle with my commute, to even suggest I pay for expensive Ubers, rather than admit his vulnerability and the state of his car, that stings. It makes me question things. But at the same time, I also feel a strange, unexpected closeness to him. This shared struggle, the raw honesty of his confession, and the teamwork we put in to fix the car, has created a different kind of bond. It's a weird feeling, this blend of hurt and intimacy, and I can't fully explain it. But the most important thing is, we found a solution. This morning, he drove me to and from work. It felt normal almost. And going forward, depending on the day, either he will drive me or I will drive myself in his car with his permission, of course. It's not ideal, but it's a workable plan. I can get to work, and his car is safer. We still have a lot to talk about, a lot to unpack regarding his financial struggles and his reluctance to share. But for now, the immediate crisis is past, and we've taken a significant step forward, even if it was a bumpy ride to get here.